Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and I am Jeremy. So I think I may be the only engineer who's going to be speaking with you. No, maybe not. So hopefully you don't move me off the stage or anything, but I actually sit in the design group at VMware, which is interesting and sometimes makes for a really different dichotomy inside of the relationships that I build. So most of the team that I'm on is actually designers. And then there's a group of us who actually build out our design system. And I'm a part of that team. I help manage the priorities and what we build and building relationships and things like that. And Clarity Design System, first off, how many of you have heard of it before? Oh, wow, I'm surprised. More than I would have expected. I expected the other folks from VMware to raise their hands, so thank you. And for the rest of you who haven't heard of Clarity, it's a design system much like other design systems, but I'll mention a little bit more briefly in a moment what the full extent of Clarity is. But it's really our design language. It's how we want to present ourselves to the customer, as well as how we want the customer experience to be standardized across many of our different products. And so, without much further ado, this is the kind of stuff that we're going to cover in this story of how we built Clarity from nothing into what we have today. And so, there's really a brief introduction to what Clarity is, in case you're not familiar with it. Then we'll go through part 1, 2, and 3 of this saga. And the part 1 is really its beginnings and that first year. There's key lessons that we've picked up throughout along the way. And then there'll be the era of open source and rapid growth, but also sustained growth, fortunately for us. And finally, part 3 is kind of where we're at today, where we're going next, how we're going to evolve beyond our roots. And then summarize those things back together. So I think it's really important that as we think about these different lessons in this story, that you tie it back to something inside of your organization. So think about something. We've heard some interesting stories already this morning about organizational change and how things have been brought through. Some of these will be kind of mirrored in some ways, but your story and your organization is going to have differences from mine. And what I want you to do is keep that in mind as I'm sharing things. The kinds of things that we overcame, you might be able to reflect that back on side of your organization and your whatever initiative you might have going on, and figure out what you can do to bring it to the next level. So as promised, there we go. What is Clarity? So this is our nice logo. It's actually a little bit washed out. There's more color there. But anyways, Clarity is our open source design system, which is comprised mainly of 3 parts plus a 4th I like to throw in there. But there's our UX guidelines. So we define what the pattern should be like. And this is for our company. This is for our products. And I like to say it's the do's and don'ts. Do this, but don't do that. And this also includes guidelines around accessibility concerns and color usage, things that standardize, but also things that are good for all types of inclusive design. And then we codify that inside of our design resources, which we have Sketch and Figma libraries, which give our designers, and anyone actually, they're open source and available for anyone to consume. It gives anyone the ability to quickly prototype things that look and feel just like the rest of the design system. And this is really important because it helps level set the conversation between developers and designers. And then the third main piece is our set of components. We have some what we call UI components that are just CSS based, so they're very simple and it can apply anywhere. And we have some more interactive components like our data grid and very more complex interactive components. And those we've built with Angular. If you're not familiar with Angular, I'll talk more about this later in the talk, but it's a framework for the front end to build applications. React, Vue, Ember, these are some other very popular ones. We've chosen and built largely upon Angular. Oh. Don't want to get that one wrong. And then our last piece is an icon library. And so I think it might actually be 400 plus icons right now. We release lots of icons, and some of them are particular to our products, but we tried to VMwareize them to the point where they're somewhat useful to all types of applications, but that makes it even more useful because people are not pulling in all kinds of icons all over the place. So that's Clarity at a glance, and my role is largely in bringing it together and in leading the efforts for the priorities and the development. I am an engineer, but I do a lot of PM work as well. So part one is the genesis. I was not actually part of the beginning of Clarity. This happened back in 2016. And this was when I talked to the founders, or the ones who I could reach. January 2016 was the inception point of when they actually started work on something called Clarity. Prior to that, though, there had been some things happening. There had been discussions and murmurings and ideas floating around. There was stuff simmering. In fact, there were other design, they weren't necessarily called design systems, but component libraries, frameworks, whatever people wanted to call them, floating around the company. And a lot of them were in different places and had limited reach or focused on certain products and not others. So it's actually not the first thing that VMware has tried to create, but it is founded around 2016 at the very beginning of the year when a product kind of shifted some company priorities and about four engineers, designers had some new capacity that wasn't there before. And they partnered with our VP in our particular part of the company in order to start trying to figure out how do we decouple a few things and how do we make things a little bit simpler. There were really three main goals, probably more than this, but three main goals that I wanted to highlight, which are duplicate efforts across teams. We had people designing and developing the same basic buttons, the same basic navigation patterns, but they weren't quite the same. Users could see that because as the company has grown, we went from lots of different products to products that are merging more into one unified interface. And so as we brought these things together, it became more painfully obvious that these were not the same, and obviously that we're building the same thing n number of times. We needed to standardize the design patterns. These are really important because in one place a button could do this, in another place a button could do that, but they looked identical, and that wasn't a good experience, which ultimately led to the final outcome, which is improving usability and user experience, which included raising profile on our accessibility issues, raising profile on dark patterns that might have been creeping in unexpectedly. So these primary goals are the things that we wanted to go after as a team in the early days. In order to do that, you have to actually build something. And so the actual initial few months was spent building up something very, very quickly, because people won't take you seriously and adopt a tool unless it's worth adopting, and there has to be something functionally beneficial. And so it took the first half of the year, really, to build up enough of a base so that it was useful enough for the rest of some other products to start to consume. And as I mentioned, we had the VP in our group support, VP over, I actually don't know, user interfaces in our products, was in support of this, which was really important aspect to the process because that gave us some of the latitude, but we also then had to prove out the idea actually was worth something. So around the midpoint of the year, we actually started to integrate with a couple of key products. vSphere is our main flagship product, which is the main control plane. So VMware's, I should have mentioned, in case you're not familiar, VMware's domain is in data center software, virtualization. And doesn't matter what that means. This is our main product, vSphere. That's sort of the central place to go to manage all of the stuff that we operate. And so this is the big project that we were able to start with. And we were helping to offload some work for them, simplify some things, and it was actually very hands-on. There was lots of inter-team communication, not necessarily being on the same team per se, but lots of collaboration and working with each other to bring this to life. And that started to roll out within in the second half of the year. And people started to take notice that there were some improvements and changes. But this is a big product, so it takes a long time. In fact, we're still working on it in some ways because there's lots of aspects of the application that are 15, 20 years old. And as you know, change can be quite difficult. So it's still an ongoing process to bring everything up. And even though we have brought most of it up, there's still aspects that might be either unaddressed at this moment, or we've evolved some additional things that we need to kind of continually renew some interfaces. So, you know, this is not a done deal. It never will be. But we've brought a lot of these goals together and actually brought some value. But the real issue was at this time, in the very first year, we were in what we call our business unit. And we were one of, I don't remember at the time if there were 10 or 12 business units, but we were just one business unit. And we didn't really get beyond that business unit in the first year. And this is probably likely in lots of organizations. We had to figure out what was actually going to work in our group to get the right foundation started so that we had the support that we could thrive within our little piece of the company. But we didn't yet know enough about how to get it out to the rest of the company. What were their values? What were the things that would convince them to come with us on this journey? And that took some time and effort to try and discover that, but we weren't terribly successful in bringing it beyond our business unit in our first year. And part of that is we have to understand our organization. So this was mentioned, there's top and bottom down organizations. So this is the top down idea where ideas and often the direction of how to fulfill that idea comes somewhere from above. And if you're down in the individual contributor level, like most of the people who are actually building the design system, you would hear the mandate, and then everybody jumps and figures out what's their contribution to that mandate. And then there are bottom-up organizations. They flip the script, where lots of ideas are generated by the folks actually doing the work, and those things eventually become grassroots efforts that flow upward. And then management starts to say, hey, this is working, let's bring it over here. And then eventually it gets noticed by the main leaders in the company. And we can say that now we have that type of relationship at the executive level where they actually recognize that clarity is a fundamental part of the company, but not initially. This took time. This took time because VMware is much more a bottom-up type organization than a top-down. It also means, though, there's lots of silos and lots of different groups who are trying to compete. In fact, other design system type initiatives were also trying to convince other groups that they needed to gain the adoption. So these were some of our challenges in the first year. But our real main key lesson was that we had to know the piece of the organization that we were in really well. And that way, we were able to partner with our VP, with our key products that we could reasonably work with, and bring something to life and prove it out. That was our first real goal, is prove it out and show everybody that it's worth it. And then we can talk about investing in other ways. So in this, have you seen this? This is the Monument to the Discoveries, which is a really cool site down on the waterfront. And what it does is show, here in Lisbon, some of the, I think around 40 different discoverers that were part of the era of discovery that happened in the 1700s in that era. And so these are folks who knew how to go out and work the organization. They figured out how to get the money they needed for their journeys. They figured out how to get the crew. They figured out where they were going to go, or they guessed and discovered along the way. But they knew how to build an expedition and actually make things happen. And that's how they're now remembered here on this symbolic monument. But know your own organization. Are you top-down or bottom-up? Maybe you're a blend of both, depending on what it is. Who are your allies? Who can help you? Who's going to maybe work against you? And how can you converse with them? Some of the groups that we've not necessarily competed with, but we've worked with in parallel tracks of kind of trying to figure out, well, where's the duplication? How can we figure out a path forward? Sometimes that's worked and sometimes it hasn't, but by spending that time and effort, we've built better relationships and we've worked across the organization. So by knowing how it works, that kept us alive for that first year. I think if we hadn't learned more about the organization, it would have been just another thing that got started. It might have been added to a couple of products, but at the end of the day, probably got pulled out of the projects, and then it would have just sort of lived on only as a maintenance mode kind of thing, which is actually how many design systems work in companies that I've talked to. They've had a lot of trouble where they internalize everything, and it kind of gets to the first iteration, it's used, but then nobody touches it again, and it's sort of just stagnant. We didn't want to be stagnant. We wanted to live and grow and prosper. And the challenge was we were still stuck in this smaller organization group, and we weren't really sure what the best path forward was. But part of our next phase, and the next part of our story, is really around the choice to go open source. How many of you are familiar with open source and how it really works? Okay, so about half of you. Open source is not just software. I want to start with that, real brief. Open source is laying the cards on the table. It's about being part of a community rather than just driving software out. I can ship you and give you code or deliverables of whatever nature it might be and call that open source. To me, that's just free software. Open source is really about bringing a community together around something that means something to that whole group and being able to contribute. Having the option, whether or not you ever choose to, but the option to contribute, engage, and interact. That might be posting questions or posting feature ideas or actually sending in new designs or new code. And we went open source at the end of 2016. So at the end of the first year, we actually were able to start this process of going open source, and we have a whole legal and open source team collaboration that makes that work. So we have a very strict policy in how that works internally, which was great, but we had to navigate all of that. But as we were going through this process, we had to really define why. Why did we want to go open source? And the first, and actually the best legal defense reason for it was in this vSphere product that I mentioned. Third-party companies will integrate their software, so they'll write things to add in as plugins. Well, they need to have a similar look and feel too. And open sourcing our UI library for them actually makes that completely seamless for them to finally consume and use our software without a whole bunch of licensing issues. So that was a good legal defense. So it's always good to have those kinds of things in your back pocket, but they weren't the real reasons driving us, because we really wanted to manage this and create this project out in the open. We were already doing that inside the company, or at least inside of our organization, where we were very collaborative, very open. People knew what our plans were. We kept them up to date every time we made a release. We made sure if we fixed a bug that we informed them. So we wanted to keep that mindset going, and we wanted to bring it to a larger group as well. And there's some other tactical things like on something called GitHub is a website for open source code, and using that, plus there's a stream of services around it, that saves us a lot of energy because a lot of stuff gets managed for us. And also the big piece that comes out of this is we're now public, we can have greater reach. We can talk about it in public. We can share this with other people. In fact, we know that there's at least 6 or 7 other companies that have told us that they use Clarity as their own design system. They customize a little bit of it, but they consume it as their own. And because of our greater reach capacity, that was possible. So these are the reasons we chose the different open source model versus being just private and internal to the company. But a lot of it has to do with how we chose to manage, which is really about being open and inclusive. And that's really, from the start, how we wanted it to be open source, but also inclusive. The initiatives that you want to go for, whether it's design or otherwise, have to include people. People have to feel like they have a say in it. It doesn't mean they get their way. It doesn't mean that whatever they say is going to become the exact thing that you build. It doesn't even mean that you ever get to their suggestion. But having the ability to be part of the conversation changes the way that people view you. It changes the dynamic of the relationship. And now that we're open source, we can also say, hey, you'd really like this feature? Great. Can you work with us? Can you help us? It's not just, okay, we're going to do this and take it off to the side and build it. We can actually spend more time talking about, okay, how do we want to build it, and work together to actually make it happen. We have a number of contributors who aren't in the company who have submitted large amounts of features which took weeks or months to finalize. And it's amazing that we could have done that in open source, but internally, that would have been very different. So it's really, really interesting that we wanted to be open and inclusive, but open source was really the best way for us. Now, this was the piece of actually generating awareness, though, because we were in this small organization, as I mentioned from the first step. We were focused primarily in our little group, and we had trouble reaching beyond that. So yes, going open source drove awareness externally, of course, because now we can promote it and we can talk about it at conferences, but those aren't necessarily the people inside of our company in those other business units that we would love to work with. And what happened was not overnight, but within a couple of months, we started getting emails or Slack messages or Skype calls, I don't know. We got messages from all kinds of venues from people in teams in other parts of the company who are asking us questions about how to use it. How do they get started? Or they already started using it, and now they had a question about this or that or a feature. And we're like, whoa, hey, where are you at? You know, we see that you're part of the company, but what project are you working on? How are you using Clarity? And so being open source actually increased awareness internally as well. Our open source team has also promoted Clarity internally as one of our best open source projects at VMware. It's definitely one of the most popular based on the traction and things like that. We get millions of downloads a year. We get tens of thousands of visitors to our website, I think monthly. Lots of cool metrics that sound really impressive, but the key thing is that we still have a high level of engagement with anyone who reaches out to us. And that's internal and external. So we have managed to build up that momentum with lots and lots of interest and adoption, but also keep that inclusive, open culture where we manage our backlog and keep track of what's going on, but folks are still engaged and welcome to join us in that process. It is quite difficult to keep track of. In fact, that's most of my time. I really don't write code anymore, which I would love to, but anyways, that's a different question. So for this part of our lesson, you know, this is about 2 years of growth and adoption, I'd say, from end of 2016 to the end of 2018, was really that growth. There's lots of little steps along the way. We added new features. We reached out to new projects. We found new partners and some external contributors and folks who got engaged. So we chose to manage this to be open and inclusive, and that really drove some of our key goals. The adoption. While we love the fact that other companies are using it, it's not necessarily our primary goal to just open source a design system for them. We have our internal uses and needs that are our primary concerns as well. And I love this photo. It's a statue of a fado singer and guitarist. And from what I know about fado, and if you've never experienced like an authentic one, it's really, really cool. The idea is that they'll actually take turns, like the wait staff or folks working in the kitchen might actually come out and sing a little bit for 15 minutes or something like that. And this is what my experience was like. There was the primary singer, but they took a break, and someone from the back came out and took their position for a little while. So they were open about that. It was inclusive. I think anybody in the audience probably could have if they knew how to sing in Portuguese. And it was really such an amazing evening because the energy was there, and it was passion, and people just loved it because everybody could be involved, I think, was a key part to it. So this is a key piece of Portugal's history, especially in the last century, is this type of art. And so check it out if you haven't. I recommend it. But adoption, growth, these are great things, but they also lead to problems. And I should also mention that open source is not a magic bullet. It does come with some caveats. It is harder to manage. You have people who are coming from anywhere asking for anything, and you have to figure out what to do about that. Expectations are different. You're now public. How do you communicate? What kinds of things do you say publicly, and what do you say privately? This is a challenge. Sometimes we say, we'd like to do this. What do you think? And that sometimes turns into a bad idea. You want to maybe flush out your idea a little bit more before you open it up. On the inverse, we learned a lot. When we say things like that, it's like, okay, this is theoretical. We're not committed to it yet. So how do we define, the commitments? How do we balance the needs of all of the individuals and the groups that are involved? You open that up, you get just more challenges to make sure that all works. So it may not work for everybody, but it's certainly been a good model for us. And I can't imagine if it were internal where we would be today, but I don't think we'd be anywhere near as far without it. But with those challenges, this is only working sometimes. There we go. For those challenges, we have to figure out the next story, the next part of our story, which is mostly this year and I think for the next year as well. We're in a phase of renewal, of evolution, and redefining some of our ideas of what Clarity is, what our users need, and honestly, redefining who some of our users are, and ultimately trying to bring this to fruition to remain relevant into the coming years. So, I told you about Angular at the very beginning, and this came back to bite us a little bit, not necessarily in a bad way, but in a challenge, because most of the key products that we were working with were built with Angular. So we built with Angular, and this was, I'll use the word synergy. This was a good thing because it allowed us to quickly build things. It worked seamlessly with what they needed to build, and it just made sense to everybody. But not everybody uses it. And we've had acquisitions that come in. They've got different systems. We've got people from other companies who are like, we like what you're doing, but we don't use Angular, or we don't plan to, whatever the case may be. So this is a thing that we saw back in 2017. We saw this problem, and we knew like this was going to eventually come up. And it came up occasionally, but it was never such a big deal that we had to change our direction. And if we had changed our direction earlier than now, we might have also been in trouble, because this has been a key to our adoption, was high quality, consistency, and working with Angular has given us a lot of things that we would have had to either build ourselves or things we couldn't do without it. But we did see this coming in 2017, and in fact, in the middle of 2017, our icon library, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning, was actually built in a new idea that would hopefully be used for all of our product, or for everything in Clarity, which is something called web components. I won't bore you with the details, but web components basically is a way of writing UI pieces that can be reused, and the browser understands it, but you don't need JavaScript frameworks. Everybody can understand it. So it lets you then build your own application in whatever framework you want, and you can just drop in the Clarity components if they're written in web components without any other frameworks. It decouples us essentially from Angular, which is one of the goals that we have coming to the future. So we prototyped this in 2017. We saw this coming. We thought, OK, we're going to secretly add this prototype in as our icon library using web components. So this technology was new. I mean, it's not totally new, but it's only really recently become viable based on how browsers work and how support for our Internet Explorer is still out there. We have challenges to technically deliver the technology. The concept is fairly simple, but the technology has been lagging. But for a basic use case of icons, we were able to make it work. We proved it out, and lots of people still today don't realize that those are not Angular functionality. So we proved out that we can decouple. You can use our icons today in any framework. It works just fine. Most people just don't realize it, because we haven't really promoted that as a lot of the benefit, because we're still very centric to Angular. But our initiative now is actually to stay relevant, I think, is to decouple those things so that we can be built around these web component technologies that share that all browsers can understand, that all frameworks can understand, and fundamentally, everybody can just use it. There's some internal needs, like the different teams that we've acquired, or teams who just want to use something other than Angular. Sometimes they want to pick the new thing, which is, if you're in development space, you know that every day there's a new JavaScript framework, or 5. But in reality is we just don't want to be a part of that debate anymore, and we want to be inclusive again to all. Inclusive and open means we need to make sure that we decouple from one choice. And so this is a hard evolution because it's rewriting everything. It's rethinking everything. And we have to do it in such a way that nobody notices that we rewrote it until we're done. And this takes time. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of planning, and we're in the early phases of that right now. But we identified this, and we're still just now getting to it 2 years later. So evolution doesn't always happen the way you want it, when you want it. You've got to, maybe you see it on the horizon. You know, there's a storm coming. Let's batter down the hatches. Well, maybe that storm doesn't come for a while, okay? This is that case. But it finally did come to the point where we could finally justify this as a business expense and operational expense, right? It takes time. It takes away from other things. So now that we're doing it, though, it is exciting because now people are engaged again in ways that they couldn't be before. But it's a challenge that we're going to have to nail in the coming months. We also had one that we didn't see coming. And earlier this year, GDPR, everybody in Europe knows GDPR, but in the US, there's also some new privacy and accessibility related laws coming into effect. And their real teeth are in how you sell to governments and public sector. So we need to make sure that we are aligned as well with our products and Clarity as a key component in many of our products with those accessibility needs. And so Clarity is at the forefront of that. We have to make sure that whatever we build is fully accessible, and it may not be the way that designers want it to work because they don't like the look of a focus outline on this or that, but that's how we need to make sure we can build it. We had to realign some of our priorities, and we took 3 months of essentially threw out our whole backlog for 3 months, dove deep into it, and fixed or enhanced a whole bunch of things. In fact, I hope today, quite literally, maybe right now, there will be a demo on our team of the final fix that's going to go into our next release, hopefully. So we're at the point where we're finishing and resolving that 3-month cycle. But this kind of hit us. This was like a storm we didn't see coming. You're out in the water, and that storm picks up, and you're just battered really quickly. Because we had to figure out, this is urgent, yes. New things came to light. There's the legal requirements, there's the testing requirements. You have to get these certifications. All this takes time, and we needed to make sure that we were at the front of that. And so in order to build that, we did that rapid 3 months, just double down on all of that. And I think it's been really, really good for the system, but we had to make sure that we were there and ready to go. And we were able to adjust. So our resiliency was really important here. We had to make sure that we could still keep the project going, even though we were sort of bunkering down inside of this small space and making these changes. We also had to make sure we're still communicating and doing all these things. But in our organization, that meant lots of communication, or also making sure that these fixes go out. We had to continually ship updates. We have to continually communicate through our accessibility liaison who works with the products. But ultimately, because of these unexpected evolution, we are even better than we were before. Accessibility and Clarity was very good to begin with, but there were still gaps, and we feel very confident now that what we have is very rock solid. But this still also pushes some of the challenges onto our products, because not everything can be solved only by us, so there's still steps to take in educating and helping bring things together. So really, these are the 2 examples of evolution that are in flight. One of them hit us out of nowhere, kind of. I mean, we had some foresight, but we had to strategically plan for that and buckle down and decide, hey, this is worth a total revamp of how we're doing things. We had to rethink how we do our coding, how we do our planning, how we do lots of things internally to the team to make this also happen. And we've had some missteps, but we've certainly also improved, and now I think we're much better on the other side. And then our others was with the decoupling from Angular and being able to support all frameworks is going to be strategic for our growth. So both of these are really important, but we had to be aware of them before we could do something about them. And so this, as we evolve, this is the da Gama, Vasco da Gama Bridge. This was recently built in, I believe, around the turn of the century, so it's about 20 years old. So it's a fairly new bridge in Lisbon, recently built, but they needed to address connection points and things like that. So how do they evolve? Well, they bring in a new bridge and they construct, I think it's like 10 kilometers. It's a long bridge. It's also very pretty, but by bringing this evolution together, they've helped connect new parts of the city, and that helped revitalize areas near this bridge in particular. And for Clarity, we had to do purposeful, meaningful change on a regular basis to evolve our project into a way that people still use it today, and will continue to use it in the future. Otherwise, if we just kind of stopped and maintained things, our initiative would eventually just hang out to dry. It would just become this static thing that didn't really improve over time. So that's a key piece here for us and for any initiative is, however you're going to go after it, whatever you're going to go after, the first phase and that growth period are really exciting and really important, but this is where you actually make it stick. I tell you, if all of our growth could go away tomorrow if we don't do this right. And I think that's the real evolution need and pressure to bring this thing to life. So real quick, in summary, there's these 3 things that I wanted to share today. Know your organization, how it makes decisions, who are the key folks to work with, and how can you insert yourself into those groups. Manage that project in some way so that you're open and inclusive to others. That will help with your awareness, that'll help with adoption, it'll help other people feel like they're part of something bigger. And finally, once you've gained some traction, you need to stay relevant, you need to adapt and evolve, and nothing just ends on some day and you're just done. There's always loose ends to tie up, there's always the next step, and always be ready for that next step so that you can bring that evolution to the future, and in our case, keep our design system going so that we can continually bring new features, better patterns, and improve that user experience for everybody. So that is all I have, and I just thank you for joining me today. If you want to check us out, clarity.design is our website, and you can learn more about it, or you can reach out my email here. I'm happy to talk more about it, and if you want to talk technical, great. If you don't, great. I'm also happy to talk about the organizational stuff. All right, thank you.